Testing, testing. We'll use that. Oh, okay. There you go.
So I can just hold.
Testing, testing. Will this work? No, this one's not working. Okay.
Hello.
Can everyone hear us?
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Am I audible? Excellent. Excellent, excellent. Welcome. Wow. Oh my gosh, what a turnout. Thank you so much for your patience as we did our best to fit as many people as we could in here this afternoon. It's so wonderful to see all of you here. My name is Alicia Salas, and as a university librarian at the University of Oregon, it is my honor to welcome you to the second annual lecture in the Representative Peter DeFazio Annual Lecture Series. This series is hosted jointly by the University Libraries and the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics. It promises to be an incredibly insightful evening with our esteemed guest, Nicholas Kristof, who will be introduced more fully in moments. For those of you who may not be aware, we're here because when Congressman Peter DeFazio retired from his role representing Oregon's 4th District in the House of Representatives in 2023, he and his wonderful staff worked with us to transfer 36 years worth of his congressional papers into our public archives here at the university for safekeeping, and to provide the public with access to an incredible array of primary sources that tell many important stories about the economic, social, and political development of our state, as well as the inner workings of national politics in our democratic system. This annual lecture series was established along with the DeFazio Archive, both to honor the Congressman's legacy of public service and to foster interest and engagement with public policy among our academic and civic communities here. The study of primary sources like these fuels important journalism and civic discourse like that we have the privilege to enjoy together this evening. I am delighted to share that after several years of hard work processing and preparing the over 700 boxes of historical papers, yep, the archives will be complete and open to the public next month. Yay! Finally. Okay. Our instruction and outreach archivist, Emily Moore, is here with us this evening and has been stationed outside to share more information about the archives with anyone who's interested. If you would like an introduction, find me or find Dan after the event, and we'd be happy to connect you. Congressman DeFazio is also here with us tonight in the audience. I'm really glad you could join us this evening, Congressman. With sincere thanks for all you've done. Thank you. Thank you for all you've done and continue to do to inspire the next generation of leaders and public servants. We're also joined this evening by University of Oregon President Carl Schultz. Thank you for being here. And of course, neither the preservation of the DeFazio Archive nor this program would be possible without the generous financial support of our important friends and benefactors, including our special community of library luminaries, many of whom are also here this evening. The luminaries are a group of the library's close friends and advocates who make great things like this happen. And if you're interested in learning more about being part of that community or becoming a luminary yourself, you can find Jazz after the talk. And where's Jazz? Wave Jazz. You can find Jazz after the talk. While we're on Jazz, Jazz is responsible for pulling together this evening and all the logistics, so we can definitely give Jazz a hand as well. Thank you. I want to especially acknowledge and thank the generous support of the Coquille tribe, one of Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribes, whose support of this program helps preserve the story of Congressman DeFazio's career-long work as a proponent of tribal sovereignty and his leading efforts to restore federal recognition of the Coquille tribe in 1989. To all of our supporters and partners, thank you. We couldn't do it without you. Without further ado, I would now like to hand the podium over to an incredible colleague, Philip H. Knight, Chair of Social Science and Faculty Director of the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics, Professor Dan Tishner. Dan?
Thank you, Vice President Salas, and welcome everyone. I am delighted to be part of this event named for our favorite recovering politician, Congressman Peter DeFazio. After retiring from his legendary career in the House of Representatives, Peter was named the 2023-2024 Wayne Morse Chair, which was fitting for so many reasons, including the fact that Morse was called the Tiger of the Senate for his principled independence, and Representative DeFazio became known as the Tiger of the House for his fierce advocacy of social and economic justice, the environment, Native American rights, and many other causes. We are proud to have Peter as a senior fellow at the Wayne Morse Center. So let me just say a few words about the format for this event. We will begin with an address by our 2026 Peter DeFazio lecturer, Nicholas Kristof. Then he is eager to interact with you and to answer your questions. So throughout the program, think about what you might want to ask. We will have one roving mic, although actually, normally we'd be holding a roving mic. I may be roving with this. But in any case, we will help broadcast your question. So just at that stage, raise your hand, and I'll do my best to get in as many of you as I can. Now it is a real privilege to introduce an outstanding student who will formally introduce Mr. Kristof. Oishiki Nag is a graduating senior at the University of Oregon's Clark Honors College. She is double majoring in political science and global studies with a minor in legal studies. She has also been an undergrad in the Wayne Morse Scholars Program for the past 3 years, a program for talented students with a passion for service and public affairs. Among her many activities, Oishiki is an award-winning opinion columnist for the Daily Emerald and a contributing author to Modern Diplomacy, where she has contributed in-depth analyses on international affairs and global politics. Sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it? She is currently finishing her senior honors thesis focused on forced labor in immigration detention centers, and as her primary thesis advisor, I can report that she's at 140 pages, so please stop. Finally, Oishiki plans after graduation to pursue graduate training in conflict studies and to pursue a career as either a foreign news correspondent or a conflict journalist. Please join me in welcoming Oishiki Nag.
I think I'll just hold it, yeah. Okay, good evening, everyone. I am honored to introduce this year's Peter DeFazio lecturer, Nicholas D. Kristof. Mr. Kristof grew up on a farm near Yamhill, Oregon. He caught the journalism bug early, working on the local McMinnville News Register, as well as the school newspapers. After spending a year after high school as a state officer of the Future Farmers of America, Kristof then attended Harvard University, graduating in 3 years, earning Phi Beta Kappa honors, and winning a Rhodes Scholarship to study law at Oxford University. While completing his law degree at Oxford, the pull of journalism never went far. During breaks from his law studies, Kristof wrote stories for the Washington Post during vacations in Poland and Africa. In 1984, Kristof fully committed to journalism, joining the New York Times as an economics correspondent. In 1920, Kristof and his wife, Cheryl Woodon, then also a Times journalist, won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of China's Tiananmen Square democracy movement. In 2006, Kristof won a second Pulitzer Prize for what the judges called, quote, his graphic, deeply reported columns that, at personal risk, focused attention on genocide in Darfur and that gave voice to the voiceless in other parts of the world. During his illustrious career in journalism, Kristof served as the New York Times bureau chief in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo, and he has been a regular op-ed columnist for the newspaper since 2001. In addition to his 2 Pulitzer Prizes, Kristof has won a staggering list of journalism prizes, including the George Polk Award, the Overseas Press Club Award, the Michael Kelly Award, the Online News Association's Award, and the American Society of Newspaper Editors Award. Mr. Kristof and Ms. Woodon are authors of numerous best-selling books. They include China Wakes, The Struggle for the Soul of a Rising Power, Thunder from the East, Portrait of a Rising Asia, Half the Sky, From Oppression to Opportunity for Women Worldwide, A Path Appears, Transforming Lives, Creating Opportunity, and Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. Kristof's most recent book is titled Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, published in 2024. As Kristof explains to his New York Times readers, I often report from around the world, but I'm also very interested in how we fix the rifts in America and help the tens of millions of people who have been left behind at home. I try to shine a light on topics that aren't necessarily in the headlines, but should be. He is the ideal person to be this year's Representative Peter DeFazio Lecturer and to speak to the Wayne Morse Center's theme of Common Ground, Cities and Towns Confronting Shared Challenges. Please join me in welcoming Nicholas Kristof back to the University of Oregon.
Thank you so much. I'm all set here. Thanks so much, Arshiki. Thank you. Thank you so much for that great introduction, Arshiki. I'm really honored to be here, and we're fellow columnists, so I look forward to following your career in the future as well. I am a little bit concerned that here I am, the human rights guy, and I'm making all of you guys stand. I'm concerned Fox News is going to be reporting, Kristof, A, broke the fire code somewhere, and B is making all you stand. I won't be offended if some of you want to come up here and just sit on the floor, whatever makes you feel comfortable. But I do feel a little bit like an oppressor right now. But I am really thrilled to be here, and I'm sure people, whenever they come to U of O, they always say that, Carl. But I'm just back from the Middle East, and when you're just back from the Middle East, boy, you are really glad to be back in Oregon. So, and it's an honor and privilege also to give the Peter DeFazio Lecture. Peter is somebody whose career I've enormously admired. In Congress, you see show horses and work horses, and Peter really, in his career in Congress on issues like transportation and infrastructure, just mastered them to the benefit of Oregon and to the entire country. And we all are beneficiaries of your work, Peter. I also, I'm also a little bit jealous because, Peter served 36 years in Congress, and, I had a 10-minute political career, and I couldn't even figure out how to get on the ballot. I'm probably the first person in Oregon history to run for governor and not have a single ballot cast in his favor. But my wife Cheryl here, Cheryl puts it more gently. She says, Nick, this side of Kim Jong-un in North Korea, you're the only politician in history ever to have had an entire political career, never had a single person cast a ballot against you. So Cheryl is a supportive spouse. One of the things that I think also characterized Peter's political career was the fact that he represents frankly, a swing district. There is Eugene in it, but there's also a lot of rural areas. Didn't George W. Bush win this congressional district in 2000? Yeah, and so Peter was representing a lot of folks who disagreed with him, and so he was bridging a divided America before I explain to you my secret formula in the next 45 minutes for how to bridge that divided America. By the way, when I was in the Middle East just now, I was practicing by bridging a divided Middle East. See how well that went. But we'll see what we can do. And then I think one more aspect of Peter's career that I admired was that, over my lifetime, we've gone from politicians who, when I was a kid, were often, people turned to them as not just political leaders, but as moral leaders. And I think that these days, one of the reasons why the Pope's remarks have had such resonance and the Pope's clash with President Trump has had such resonance is that the Pope is indisputably a moral leader. And I think there is this yearning at a time when political leaders often don't seem to have that moral imprimatur, that there is that yearning for not just political leadership, but for moral leadership. And, I offended somebody. I don't know who it was. Maybe I shouldn't have made that joke about the fire code. But Peter, in your career, you took on issues that I don't think constituencies were fighting you to demand, in things like animal rights, things like very early on Palestinian rights. And there weren't a lot of votes in these things, but they were moral issues. And I appreciate a political leader who does bring a moral compass to the table as well. So thank you for that. Well, in talking about how to bridge a divided America, let me start with a scene that very much shaped the kind of journalist that I became. It was not actually in a divided America, though it was in a divided China. So Cheryl and I were the New York Times correspondents in Beijing during the Tiananmen democracy movement. We covered that and the massacre that followed, and it very much transformed the kind of journalism that I wanted to practice, the priorities that I brought to the table. And I think one of the things that I look back on, and especially at a time when in recent years here in the US, we've had a real authoritarian drift. I've thought back to that spring of 1989 in Beijing. And in particular, I look back at, frankly, with a certain amount of embarrassment or even shame at the way I reported some of the democracy movement, in particular the students and workers. And I wrote several times that, well, they say they're campaigning for democracy, but they can't really define the kind of democracy they want. They can't describe the institutions or the guardrails that would make it work, and it's all kind of fuzzy and so on. And that was true, but that terrible night of June 4th, 1989, when the troops moved in to massacre the students, some of the most extraordinary courage I've ever witnessed in my life came on the part of those workers and those peasants who might not have been able to define democracy, but were laying down their lives for it. And in particular, I'm sure many of you have been to Beijing. How many of you have been to Beijing? So many of you will remember the airport road. So now it's actually an airport highway, but back then in 1989, it was a 2-lane road. And all over Beijing, there were workers who were trying to stop the troops from reaching Tiananmen Square to protect the students and keep the troops away. Everybody knew that the troops were on their way to Tiananmen and they were trying to protect the students. So there was a salt-of-the-earth bus driver who had taken his public bus, and he was there in case the troops came down the airport road. And sure enough, that evening he saw a big convoy of troops approaching, so he hurriedly parked his bus across the airport road to block it, fully blocked it. And he turned off the engine, he had the keys in his hand, he stepped out, the convoy ground to a halt. An officer stepped out of the lead truck and ordered him, "Move the bus." And the bus driver said no. And again, the officer, this time he pulled out his sidearm and pointed it at the bus driver. And he said, "Move the bus." And this bus driver, he had the keys in his hand, he hurled them as far as he could into the high grass by the side of the road that night. You know, I think about that guy who I'd written very condescendingly about people like him, and he might not have been able to define democracy, but he was ready to die for it. And I've come to think instead, in fact, that people like him actually maybe had a deeper understanding and a deeper appreciation of the value of democracy precisely because they lived under Maoist dictatorship for decades. And that in fact, in recent years, I've come to think that maybe we in this country have something to learn from people like that bus driver and the courage and determination that they showed in trying to build a democracy there. And I thought about that partly because of the challenges that we face in this country with this authoritarian drift. And in journalism, we're in many ways on one of the cutting edges of that. But I also think about it because, as Oshiki mentioned, I'm living in Yamhill, Oregon, my hometown where I grew up, and Yamhill is a red community. I mean, it voted about 2-1 for Trump in each election, and when I was busy getting vaccinated, all my friends were warning me not to get vaccinated. I'm surrounded by people who I care deeply about, and they care deeply about me, and we completely disagree about politics, about vaccinations, about so many values, and they frustrate me and I frustrate them, and yet we have to live with each other and we have to learn from each other. And they've taught me a few things, and one of them is that just a starting point to any kind of effort toward greater civility is some starting point of humility. And I think actually that I suspect, this being Eugene, that probably most folks in the room share my liberal values, and that earlier generations of liberals, including mine, that we had a clear sense that actually we screwed up some really important issues. And in the 20th century, maybe the most important foreign policy issue was totalitarianism. And there were an awful lot of people on the left who were on the wrong side of that and were soft on communism, soft on Maoism. Here we have the most fundamental foreign policy issue lasting for decades and decades. And many in my liberal world, with the best of intentions, with the greatest fervor, just screwed up on it. And meanwhile, you look at conservatives and the most important domestic issues of the last 100 years, civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, I would argue that they screwed up on the most important domestic issue of that period. And so I think we all have a great deal to be humble about and to acknowledge that just because you feel absolutely confident of something doesn't mean you're actually right. If even if you look back just at COVID a few years ago, I think Republicans completely screwed up in failing to appreciate the severity of COVID-19 and the importance of vaccines. But we liberals screwed up in prolonged school closures that did enormous damage, some of the most vulnerable kids in the country. And in Oregon, we screwed up a lot more than in other states. So I find that it's sort of helpful to try to remember that just because I feel incredibly passionate about something doesn't necessarily mean I'm right. And it's very hard being a columnist where your job is to yell at people and tell them what to think, to try to mix that with humility. But what I find is that you can't, my approach is to unflinchingly stand for what I perceive at the moment to be right, unflinchingly. And yet at the same time, recognize that I may end up being proved wrong. And that's a contradiction. But the benefit of that contradiction is it makes you a little bit less likely to wag your finger and be sanctimonious and shout somebody down, none of which ever persuades anybody of anything. And I think that another thing I've learned from my friends is just the importance of engagement. One of the saddest things that I encounter is people who don't want to go back to their families for Thanksgiving because there are people around the table who are going to disagree with them. And I would really encourage everybody to engage with people whom you disagree with. And what I find is that you don't have to avoid the really difficult topics. But what I commend to you as an approach is what some social scientists call complexifying an issue. So, for example, in Yamhill, a lot of my neighbors are deep believers in Second Amendment gun rights, and meanwhile, I'm a deep believer in gun safety legislation. And yet you can have a conversation, but what complexifying it means is you don't talk about the issue at 30,000 feet. You don't talk about the Second Amendment. You don't talk about banning handguns, but you talk about a issue that is more murky, more borderline. So what I will do is I'll tell my friends, look, we all recognize there has to be some minimum age to buy a firearm. You don't want a 12-year-old going into Walmart and buying a firearm. There has to be some minimum age. Well, in Wyoming, about as red a state as you can get, the minimum age is 21. Now, here in Oregon, you can engage in some firearms purchases at 18. Shouldn't we maybe have the same minimum age as Wyoming? Now, they may disagree with me, but they're willing to have that conversation. Or likewise, that, okay, a convicted felon cannot buy a firearm. What about somebody who's got a violent misdemeanor conviction in the last 3 years? And again, they're willing to have that conversation. But they're only willing to have that conversation if I'm willing to listen to their arguments about how demented liberals are and wanting to control firearms. And so you've got to, people will only listen to you if you're willing to listen to them. And I think the other thing that goes along with that is to recognize that we all have selection biases in how we get our news. There's this abundant evidence in social science that actually, and it's kind of depressing to admit this as a journalist, but as human beings, we don't seek the best information. There was one really good early study from the 1960s that sent mailings out to people and sort of what they wanted to get. And what information people most want to get is information that makes the other side look really stupid. And what they want next is information that makes their side look really smart. And what we least want is intelligent critiques of our own positions. And that's kind of a broad human failing. And it's magnified in the internet age. Early on in the internet age, there was a media thinker called Nicholas Negroponte at MIT. And he wrote that with the internet, there was going to be this product that we would all have access to called the Daily Me. And that's what we all get now. We all get the Daily Me, you know, that's in our social media feed. That's how we get it. And it's tailored to confirm all our prejudices about the world, all our biases. And I think it's just so important to push back at that and to resist that. You know, my own practice is, well, let me put it this way. So every morning I go for a run around our farm, and you know, it's often painful, and I sweat, and it's difficult, but I do it because I think it makes a better me. And in the same way, every morning I read the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, and it's painful, and I sweat, but I do it because it makes a better me. And I think it's important to try to, you know, reach out to these other sources. And I think we sometimes don't appreciate how people on the other side of this divided America see us and our values. And of course, in Yamhill, I encounter that all the time. And let me tell you a little about Yamhill. You know, population 1,000 on a good day. Traditionally, it was the economy was based on agriculture, timber, and light manufacturing, and then and there was a long period where it was very upwardly mobile. The 5 kids who got in the school bus right after me each morning were the 5 Knapp kids. Farland Knapp, who was my year in school, and his brother Zeelan, brother Nathan, sister Regina, and baby brother Keelan. And you know, their dad had a union job laying pipe, and his mom had a job driving tractor. But they were able to parlay that in the 1960s and 1970s into a decent middle-class life. And they bought their first home. When Farland turned 16, they got him a Ford Mustang, and I was so jealous. But one of the challenges in Yamhill was that there wasn't an emphasis on education, partly because people had always had the view that they could drop out of school or just get a high school diploma and you'd still be able to get a job at the mill or the factory. And you know, that became no longer true. And none of the 5 Knapps graduated from high school. Farland died of liver failure from drug and alcohol abuse. Zeelan died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. Regina died of hepatitis from IV drug use. And Keelan, baby, he had survived in part because he was in the Oregon State Penitentiary for 13 years, but he was released at the beginning of the pandemic, and about a month into it, he overdosed. And their mom is still alive in her 80s and walking up the hill every day to visit the graves of her 5 kids. And I was spending a lot of the early 2000s covering the Darfur genocide, and I would come home to Yamhill to try to heal. And you know, I found there was a humanitarian crisis in my own community. At this point, more than a third of the kids on my old school bus are gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. More than a third. And I think one of the most painful things was to understand that, you know, hurt is transitive as well as intransitive. Hurt people hurt others. And so my friends suffered greatly, but they also inflicted great suffering on others. One of my best buddies, when he was high on meth and drunk, he brutally beat a woman in Lincoln City, almost beat her to death. And you know, went to prison for 20 years for it. Another two of the boys, for somebody who's written a lot about sexual violence, it was hard to understand how 2 of the boys on my old school bus ended up being convicted of raping young girls. how does that happen? And, I think it was particularly hard because in our community, we had always sort of prided ourselves on our strong rural values and our barn raisings and this kind of thing. And in Yamhill, as I think in a lot of white communities around the country, when black communities were struggling in the 1970s, there was this sense of, oh, well, problem is black culture, and those men, they just don't have the sense of personal responsibility. And meanwhile, there was an eminent Harvard sociologist, William Julius Wilson, who said, it's about jobs. And when good jobs go, then things just unravel. And he was exactly right, because when the good jobs left lily white Yamhill, the same kind of pathologies unfolded. And in Yamhill and in communities all around the country, working class communities all around the country. And when I report about global poverty in other parts of the world, I have a vocabulary, and you have metrics of malnutrition and anemia and infant mortality and child mortality and so on. But we don't really have the same vocabulary about this kind of poverty in the US, and it's a combination of everything from chronic pain to long-term unemployment, certainly addiction, educational failure, a kind of hopelessness that pervades communities. And part of that pathology is also, I think, a tendency toward conspiracy theories and a willingness to turn to a charlatan who promises that he's going to restore factory jobs and who offers people to blame for your struggles, your economic struggles. And so I see this through the prism of Yamhill, and one of the great divides in America has been not just the political divide, but the degree to which it in turn is mimicked by an educational divide and a class divide. And we liberals tend to be very cognizant of racial identities. We tend to often be kind of oblivious about class divisions and the importance of class. And the degree of resentment, I think, in a lot of working class America to, to everything that I kind of believe in and stand for in many ways. It troubles me, but there is this deep sense of betrayal, and they have a point. 1 million Americans died of overdoses since 2000, more than 1 million, and I don't think that political leaders, that journalists, that the public responded anything like appropriately to a tragedy of that magnitude. Even now, fewer than 20% of Americans with substance use disorder get access to treatment. And people see these communities unraveling. In Oregon, one of the crises for a lot of rural communities was the timber wars of the 90s. And Eugene was a center of the timber wars. Now, I think the right side won. I think that the levels of logging back then were unsustainable. I think that we want to preserve old growth forests, but I also think that we had a responsibility to understand that when we won, we were devastating some of these rural communities. And with some shame, I think we should look back and acknowledge that we, seems to me, showed more compassion for spotted owls than for a lot of these logging families. And so, that the kind of resentment that has fueled in working class communities around the country, I think that has also been magnified by a what is perceived as a disdain and condescension among the educated for the less educated. And I don't think that we perceive this at all, but I think it is very much perceived on the other side of that divide. Michael Sandel, the Harvard philosopher, he says that the last acceptable prejudice in the United States that we can just state is a prejudice toward the less educated. And I think there's actually something to that. And I think that we're often oblivious to the ways in which we steamroll people. And one example which I think a lot of you will disagree with, but since my job is to be a journalist and a provocateur, it's the issue of pronouns. So in liberal America, we embrace pronouns to be inclusive. We wanted to show that, we're supporting people and being inclusive. And that works well if you live in a world of words and you inhabit a world where things are changing and you're on email all the time and so on. But if you don't inhabit that world and feel like you're always walking on eggshells, then you don't feel included by that, and you feel like suddenly you're in this world, you don't really understand what's going on, what the rules are. And so how we navigate this world where things that we think are inclusive come across as excluding others, it's hard and it's difficult. But I do think that a starting point is to understand that it's not just about our intentions, but it's also how we come across and behave. And this year, I think, is going to be one of the most critical elections in our country's history. I think, what has been happening in America in terms of this authoritarian drift, but also in terms of what has happened to immigrants, and more broadly, to the pillars that have made America the world's leading economy. Things like the degree to which we have been able to attract some of the brightest minds from all over the world to come to some of the world's best universities because people feel some admiration for this country. I think that is in peril, and I think that's, that threatens our path 30 years from now, 40 years from now. So this year, I think, is going to be incredibly important. And so people all the time say, well, how do we fight back at authoritarianism? How do we fight to preserve our democracy? And I think they're often seeking validation for going to the No Kings protest. And No Kings protests are great, but I doubt if President Trump was quaking at the thought of another No Kings protest in Oregon. But which is not a criticism. I mean, they have their use and they build morale and so on. But I think that the most important single thing this year is going to be what happens to the U.S. Senate. And I think we should be thinking, whatever we do, what does this do to Sherrod Brown's elections chances in Ohio? And what is this going to do elsewhere? And I do think that, frankly, in Oregon and California and Washington State and the West Coast, we helped defeat Sherrod Brown, frankly. In Montana, I forget whether it was 2020 or 2022, there was a billboard outside Billings that said something to the effect of, you vote Democratic and Portland will come to Montana. I mean, that just pains me. I mean, it really does. I mean, it wounds me. Both the thought that is the reputation we have, but also the fact that we are undermining liberals and Democrats and in other places who would hold the balance of power in a very divided country. And so I think that the most important thing we can do is to elect, the Sherrod Browns, others, the more states in play now. And I think the thing Oregonians should think about is that the most important thing we can do is fix our blue places. And that requires, again, a certain humility about acknowledging that some of our blue places, are messed up. When I was in my 5-minute political career, when I was running for governor, where I'd meet people, I'd meet potential donors in Portland, and we'd gather, and these would be Democratic primary voters, so they'd also be fairly liberal. And meanwhile, our cars would be parked outside, and we'd all be, a little nervous that maybe our catalytic converters would be being stolen at that moment. Then we'd, because we were all like-minded Democrats, we'd be wanting to, thunder at how awful Republicans were. And I kept thinking, Portland's problems we just can't blame on Republicans because there aren't any Republicans in Portland. This is our mess. We created this, and we've got to claim it. I think in terms of fixing our blue places, I don't fully understand it, but somehow governance ended up working better in blue places in the Northeast than in blue places on the West Coast. The last time I looked, the two states with the highest rates of unsheltered homelessness were California and Oregon. Some of the states with the lowest rates of unsheltered homelessness were in the East. Partly that's weather, but it's not just weather. The state with the highest, with the worst access for mental health for youth was Oregon. The states with the highest were Delaware and was one other Democratic state back east. Massachusetts may have the best public schools in the country. The latest NAEP scores, adjusted for demographics, have Oregon number 50. There is something about governance on the West Coast that I think has involved a lot of purity, a tendency to turn to slogans rather than outcomes, and that, in Portland in 2003, they passed a 10-year plan to eliminate homelessness. Well, passing a 10-year plan to eliminate homelessness was probably easier than actually doing some of the heavy lifting of building housing. But there are three things in particular that I think about in that context about how we can actually try to do a better job fixing blue places. And I think about that partly not only to help Sherrod Brown win in Ohio, but also because my neighbors in Yamhill, when we talk about preserving democracy, that feels very distant and remote to them. But their understanding of what Democrats do is when they go to Portland and they see unsheltered homelessness that is worse than it was 10 years ago. And so we have to do a better job at fixing these things. And number one is homelessness, and that's up and down the West Coast, and that's about that's about building homes. We're short 200,000 housing units in Oregon. I sometimes think a model is Houston and Dallas. Both are blue cities. Both had real problems with homelessness. Both tried to address them. And in Dallas, it got worse. In Houston, they managed to reduce homelessness by 61%. And it's not about intentions. It's about actually finding, being relentlessly empirical, finding evidence-based efforts that work, then tweaking the model, executing well, constantly adjusting. And that's how, it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's partly how Houston did it. And, I kind of think that on the West Coast, too often we ended up as Dallas, full of good intentions, but not executing. And likewise, partly because I'm in Yamhill, I see the way in which I think we fumbled issues of addiction and law and order. And Measure 110 was passed with the best of intentions, and the war on drugs had failed, and we needed new approaches. And the idea was, well, let's do what Portugal did. And Portugal had I think, very successfully decriminalized drugs. But the key to it in Portugal wasn't the decriminalization part. It was the treatment part. And decriminalization was a way of getting people into treatment. And we completely muffed that inward. We failed execution of that. And Cheryl and I have a good friend, Drew, whose dad was a good friend of mine until he died after a lifetime of using drugs. And then Drew was in prison when his dad died, and we've tried to help Drew. And he was, Drew is using on and off since he was 12, but he was clean when Measure 110 was passed. And then, as he puts it, the risks after decriminalization, the risks were a little bit less, and the temptation was always there. And so he started using again, and thinking he was going to control it. And a few months later, he was homeless, and he was selling fentanyl out of his trunk. And his mom and I were we were beside ourselves, and we were kind of praying that Drew was going to get arrested. And I hated to want my friend to be arrested, but I was afraid he was going to kill himself or kill somebody that he sold the fentanyl to. And he actually came to Eugene, and he was homeless in Eugene. And he was also, I should say, in this period, he was robbing stores on an industrial scale. He discovered that apparently it was sort of common knowledge you don't shoplift from Walmart, because Walmart a guard will stop you at the door. But Target and Home Depot, if any of you are criminally minded, those are the places to go. The guards are instructed not to stop you, and so Drew would go into Home Depot and Target and fill up his shopping cart with things that he knew he could fence at pawn shops, and walk out, and the guard would say, "Stop, stop, stop," and Drew would go right out to his car, from which he'd remove the license plate, and put the stuff in the car, drive to the pawn shop, and sell it, and then go back to the store. And he said he stole more than $100,000 worth of merchandise in a year from those two stores. And again, I think, with the best of intentions, full of compassion, we actually made things worse for people like Drew. And, he kind of felt that too. And then there was, here in Eugene, he at one point just walked up to a cop and said, "There are a bunch of warrants out for me. Please just take me in." And the cop obligingly did. And so he was transferred to Yamhill County, and at his trial in Yamhill County, the defense attorney said, "Great news, I'm pretty sure we can get you off, because the chain of custody for when your fentanyl was seized at some point, they didn't have a good chain of custody at the sheriff's office, and I think we can deny it was yours, and I think we can get you off." And Drew said, "No, no, no." And at his trial, Drew insisted to the judge that he be sent not to the Yamhill County jail, but to the state penitentiary, because they had a treatment program there. And he went to there, and he got into the treatment program, and he did brilliantly, and he was released, and now he's doing great, and he has a moving company and so on. But I think about that, and about how important it is that we not just focus on our good liberal intentions, but on the outcomes. And the final area that I think has to be pivotal for fixing our blue places is education. And I think about that especially because when I think what would have made a difference for that 1/3 of the kids on my old school bus who are gone today, and what would make a difference for a lot of my friends who see the world very differently than I do, I think education is maybe the thing that might matter the most. And I also think that I look back at the 1970s when I was in school, and I think, so many kids were dropping out. What were those adults thinking that they allowed so many kids to drop out? And then I think, well, today, what are we all thinking when we still allow 1 in 7 kids in America to drop out of school? 1 in 7. What are we thinking? How the best metric for where a society is going to be in 30 years is education. And we've got to do a better job, especially for those struggling working class kids who don't have a supportive home environment. And other states have figured that out. We've got to do a better job here. This has been kind of a little depressing walk through through what is supposed to be this encouraging thing about how we bridge our divides. But let me leave you with a little bit about why I do have a measure of optimism. And part of it is, look, I spent much of my career covering authoritarianism, and they always look very strong. And then they do two things that just fail them every time. And one is that because they're surrounded by yes men, so they screw up policy, economic policy. That's what matters. They screw up economic policy. And secondly, because they've gotten rid of guardrails, so they can engage in corruption, and they do. And that just really pisses off voters and pisses off the public. And so that catches up with them. And so, we just saw the election results in Hungary. A few years before that, you may remember President Duterte in the Philippines was, the ultimate strongman. He's in a jail cell in The Hague right now. And so these larger forces, I think, do matter. They encourage me. And maybe more broadly, one of the things I've learned in my career is that when we are challenged, we can be an amazing species, and we can rise to the occasion. And I think in the US, we're not fully aware of that because we're not tested in the same way, and you don't have warlords rampaging through Eugene and doing terrible things and seeing how wonderfully human beings can respond. But I have seen that. And yes, some humans behave abysmally, but others behave brilliantly. And what you see is that side by side with the worst of humanity, you find the very best. And I'll leave with an example of that. In rural Pakistan, I encountered this incredible woman named Mukhtar Mai, who had been sentenced by her village council to be gang raped as punishment for something her brother supposedly had done. And then the village council carried out that sentence, and they gang raped her. And their expectation was that she would then kill herself out of shame. And instead, Mukhtar found it within herself to go to the police, to denounce her attackers, to prosecute them, to send them to prison, and then to use compensation money for the rape to start the first school in her village, because she believed that education was the best way to respond, to chip away at the kind of misogyny and cruelty that she had suffered. And then she enrolled the children of her attackers in her school. And you just cannot be in this little village of Merwala in rural Pakistan and see the children of her attackers in little school uniforms and studying English and Urdu and math, and just not feel that when we are tested, we are capable of unimaginable reserves of strength, courage, and decency and goodness. And this is a time when we as a country, we are all being tested. And I think we truly can rise to the occasion. So thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
So Nick is graciously welcoming questions. So 3 quick things. First, note that I said questions rather than statements. So we're a big crowd. We're not going to fit everybody in who has a question. But I'd ask, as I go around and find you, that you make it brief so we can get as many as possible, and you keep it as a question. The second thing is, normally I have a handheld mic, but we have this version we will soldier through. The third thing is, for those who've been standing in back, I think you should be able to ask the first question if you have one.
Yeah.
I'm going to come find you. So if you have a question in back, raise your hand.
Yeah, thank all of you back there for your patience, and I really appreciate it.
Hello, I'm very curious about maybe a lesson from each, your mother and your father, that they contributed to your ability, to what you've done. I'm just curious about that. Thank you.
Sure. One of the themes of my career has been writing about women's rights, and I think that's because I saw the power of an educated woman has on the family, has on society. And that was what I learned when Cheryl and I wrote Half the Sky. That was my mom's influence. My dad was a World War II refugee, and the family had spied on the Nazis during World War II. Some were executed by the Soviets, others executed by the Nazis. My dad was almost executed, was in concentration camps. He was welcomed by Oregon in 1952. And truly welcomed. After he'd been here a few months, his landlady returned his rent in Portland and said, "I can't take money from a refugee." And that so moved him. It so moves me. And it feels such a painful contrast with the way immigrants and refugees are treated today. And that is very much what I've taken from them.
Hello, thank you so much for being here today. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about your experience covering the genocide in Gaza and any censorship you may have encountered in that process.
Yeah, so I haven't been able to, journalists, as you know, haven't been able to get into Gaza since October 7th, 2023. So we have been able to talk to people by phone in Gaza. We've been able to very occasionally email or more likely WhatsApp with people, but we can't actually go there. So I don't have any firsthand reporting there. I had reported in Gaza many times before that, and one impression that I don't think is fully appreciated on the left is that Hamas really was a pretty brutal organization toward Palestinians. And it was a misogynistic, homophobic organization, but it was also not Gaza. And I remember even talking to a Gaza police officer who was complaining about the corruption he was a Hamas, he wore a Hamas uniform, he was a Hamas police officer, was telling me how awful the Hamas leadership was. It's a complicated place, like all places are. And having been there and then seeing the entire neighborhoods turn into rubble, it's staggering. And so I was just in the West Bank. So a week ago, I was in the West Bank, and there's something of a Gazification policy toward the West Bank, toward some of the communities there. Rural communities are being pushed out by settlers who are really out of control. But even in places like Tulkarm, there is this policy that there was even actually a neighborhood in Tulkarm called Gaza because it had been flattened by the IDF. And I think that also I should say stay tuned for a piece that I have coming out from the West Bank soon that I think will make waves, but can't tell you what it is for fear the Wall Street Journal would scoop me. But attitude, we have so much influence over what happens in the West Bank. And just things like prisoner visits in the West Bank. There is rampant abuse and torture of detainees. And these are mostly detainees who are never charged with a crime. A simple thing like getting the Red Cross and lawyers to visit detainees would make such a difference in reducing that kind of abuse. And that is something that if we push for that, that would happen. Well, I think there's only a ceasefire starting today because the administration pushed for a ceasefire in Lebanon because they wanted, in turn, a peace deal with Iran, and that was a condition of Iran. But we have so much leverage that we have failed to use, and the Gaza and the West Bank, and now the southern part of Lebanon up to the Litani River is just a catastrophe, complete catastrophe.
Hi. I'm really curious about your statement about the reason why someone like Sherrod Brown lost his Senate race 4 years ago. I can't remember when it was. It was against our current vice president, I believe. I'm sorry. I just would like something more concrete than saying that we somehow caused that. Could you elaborate a little bit?
And that was probably a little journalistic exaggeration. I mean, there were a lot of reasons why he lost. I mean, Sherrod Brown, I think is particularly interesting because he was somebody who really did have working class credentials. He had deep roots in Ohio. He ran against a very weak opponent. And so why did he lose? It was because of the Democratic brand nationally. And Sherrod vastly outperformed Democrats nationally, Kamala Harris, but he didn't outperform enough to actually win. And in talking to people in Ohio, including Democrats in Ohio, they're pretty clear that the toxicity of the Democratic brand in Ohio for centrist voters was shaped partly by Democrats in places up and down the West Coast, on the East Coast, who make statements in their Democratic bubble without always thinking how they're going to be perceived by this centrist voter in Cincinnati who is wary of Trump but also wary of Democrats and doesn't really know quite what to do and is concerned about immigration. And so I think that, on issues of immigration, law and order, and just kind of cultural issues, I think that we made it a lot harder for Sherrod Brown to, I think we were one of the factors that led him to lose. And that's their judgment in Ohio, I think, too.
Thank you again. I think going off of your third point about education, one of the things that I was personally curious about is that there seems to be a loss of trust or confidence in higher education institutions, both from the general community, but as well as students to the administration. Where do you see higher education institutions stepping up or the community stepping up to address that loss of trust?
Yeah, I mean, I find this just kind of tragic because I think so much of American greatness right now is a function of the fact that we were basically the first country in the world to have mass education. We were the first country in the world to have mass literacy in the 19th century, the first country at the beginning of the 20th century to have mass high school attendance, the first country in the middle of the 20th century to have fairly widespread tertiary attendance. And then now we have an administration that sees universities as the enemy. And the number of the people, of Americans who say that education is very valuable has dropped by close to half since 2013. And it has become part of this culture war issue. I mean, I think most of the responsibility for that lies with the Trump administration, with the Republicans. But does higher education itself need to look in the mirror as well? Yeah, I think absolutely it does. And I think that we didn't focus enough on questions of accessibility for working class folks. And that's not just when you graduate from high school. We've had this real conversation in America about college access, but we've really ignored the fact that 1 in 7 kids doesn't graduate from high school. And I think that one of the results was this perception of elitism. I think that the focus under Biden on debts magnified that perception of elitists looking out for themselves, and this sort of the issue of language and the way we liberals restructured language in ways that left people like not quite sure what word to use. Pronouns were a part of that, but it went way beyond that. I think we should. I think we all need to do a lot of reflection about the ways we inadvertently come across not as inclusive, but as excluding, not as fundamentally as being condescending. And President Trump magnified that, and then we responded by so many liberals ended up saying that every Trump voter is a racist and a bigot. And when you do that, A, I think that's a very unhelpful stereotype, but B, it's really hard to win support from people whom you're dismissing as racists and bigots. But it's a huge challenge we've got to figure out.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to go back to earlier when you were talking about possibly regretting some things that you had written before. What do you do when your thoughts on an issue shift, especially like when you're in the public eye?
One of the great things about being a journalist is you shift, if your views don't change over time periodically about things, then you're too stuck in the mud, I think. So that changing positions is not a particular challenge for a columnist. Also, it's kind of helpful that a week after we've written our columns, nobody ever remembers them. So they're lining the bottoms of bird cages. So, but we've got to be willing to change positions.
Mr. Kristof, if you were God and you had the resources, what would you do for your neighbors in Yamhill?
So I think that it starts with, I'd say education, but broadly, including early childhood, including early trauma. So many of the roots of, I think, the problems that we see are a result of people growing up in chaotic households, often violent households, and never having that trauma fully addressed. And then going into school systems that aren't really looking out for them, and they dismiss them early on. And their education, one of the things all over the world that I see is that the best escalator toward greater opportunity, toward a more equal society is education. That's true in Zimbabwe and it's true in America. What's also true everywhere is that escalator tends to be broken for those who most need it. And let me just commend one organization to you that has now come to Oregon that I'm excited by. It's called Vision to Learn. It gets glasses in the hands of kids in early grades who, if it's your kid or my kid and they need glasses, they'll get them. If they break their glasses, they'll get another pair. For an awful lot of kids, they don't get those glasses. And then particularly if they're boys, then they get bored and they pull the hair of the girl in front of them, then they become troublemakers and they live up to that. So boys 15-year-old boys in juvenile detention were vastly overrepresented of kids who can't see. And finally, for the first time, they get a vision screening into the glasses when they're 15 in juvenile detention. They needed that in second grade. So Vision to Learn is working on that problem, and it's such a cheap intervention with tremendous benefits. And it's a crime that we have let these kids in Yamhill and elsewhere fail to get that for something as simple as eyeglasses. And so education. Almost the answer to almost any question is education, you know?
What is your view on accountability after Trump? I'm a big fan of truth and reconciliation, like in South Africa, but I think a huge mistake was not prosecuting Trump after January 6th, which is a metaphor for many other failed opportunities for accountability for countless crimes. So how do we clean up after he's gone?
It's a great question, and I would kind of agree with you on the accountability, and I think Merrick Garland kind of dropped the ball on that when he was Attorney General, and it was this effort to be really careful and precise and lawyerly, and I totally understand that. But the outcome, I think, was that we did not provide accountability. But it's also hard and complicated, and it's one thing I struggle with as a writer, that how do I write about the egregious things that I believe President Trump is doing toward immigrants, for example, without coming across to that undecided Cincinnati voter as screechy and this in ways that will not be persuasive and may antagonize them, and I think that's a difficult path to follow, but I think it's important. And one of the things that I find particularly tragic was the pardons for the January 6th protesters in ways that undermined accountability and rewarded violent behavior, and I think supported a culture of violence.
Good evening, sir. You've mentioned before about how, especially in the age of social media, we are curated an information bubble for ourselves. And how do you think that contributes to, well, I think at this point we can all see that you believe it contributes to that divide. So how do we first establish a shared information base so that we can have those conversations where both sides actually agree on what the facts are?
Boy, that's a great question. And, obviously the answer is mandatory subscription to the New York Times. But I think President Trump wouldn't agree with that one. It's an incredibly important question, and it's one that is magnified as the business model for journalism collapses around the country. And so local newspaper, 2.5 newspapers are going out of business every week. For those of you in Eugene, you remember the Eugene Register Guard of 20 years ago compared to today, and it's a tragedy. It's just a tragedy, and the lack, especially as so many communities around the country are dominated either by Republicans or by Democrats, it becomes important to have some news organization that can provide oversight and accountability in governance. And those news organizations are collapsing as the business model collapses. And there are efforts with philanthropic models and others, but I worry enormously about that question, what that does to polarization, what that does to governance. And I haven't figured that one out. That should be the topic for next year's DeFazio speaker.
Nick, we're back here.
Hi, I was moved by what I saw as a story of class in your own neighborhood of Yamhill and so on. And my question is, consider these few points, and then I want to ask what kind of country we are. These few points, over the last 50 years or so, we have had a class war during which most of the wealth in this country has gone to the top. We have campaign finance that is so corrupt, you wonder when you remember what Machiavelli said about reforming a republic, if we can possibly reform this republic. And then corporate lobbying, systematic since the 1970s. How can you call us a democratic republic based on freedom and decency as opposed to an oligarchic empire based on power and the maintenance of power? That's my question.
So, I mean, democracy is a dial, and we've regressed on that dial, and it's not an on-off switch. And so for all the reasons you mentioned, I think we've regressed, and I think we regressed further under President Trump. Early in my career, I covered Taiwan, and at that point, it was a really harsh military dictatorship under martial law. Now, Cheryl and I were there in January. Now Taiwan is more democratic than the United States by most of the democratic indexes. And that's a reflection of how well Taiwan has done, but it's also a reflection of the ways we've allowed democracy to undermine itself in all the ways you described. I would just add, though, that I think it becomes too easy for us liberals to point the finger for things that are going wrong at those kind of oligarchic elements. And that does not explain how we in Oregon have allowed our high school graduation rates to be, one of the lower end of the country, why we have one of the shortest school years in the country, why our NAEP scores are 50 out of 50. There are things that we can do better, even in the context of all the abuses and misalignment of democracy that you mentioned.
So we're close to the end of our time, so I'm going to get the last three. Brenda, that's you too. So we're going to do it popcorn style,
Okay.
And so I'm going to take their questions and you can jump in.
Thank you. Mr. Kristof, in your 2024 column, you said the West Coast problem is ideological purity, not liberalism itself. That one-party dominance removes the pressure that keeps governance honest. Oregon Republicans lost every statewide race in 2024. What does a functional opposition actually look like in a state where the GOP has nationalized itself into irrelevance? Who creates the pressure you're describing that the second party can't?
Dan, do you want me to answer now, or do you want me to answer all together?
Why don't we do it all together?
Okay.
Or at least you answer the first two, and then I'll get the last one.
Okay.
I'm wondering what you think Measure 5 is doing to us in
What?
Oregon. Measure 5. How is it hampering us?
I'm sorry, what is doing? What?
Measure 5.
Measure 5. I see, right.
You can go ahead and answer those two, and then we'll...
So the oversight and accountability comes not just from a statewide opposition, although it can, but also from the public, from the media if they exist, and can come from within the Democratic Party. So Keith Wilson, the new mayor of Portland, I think that he here is this outsider who from the business community who was elected mayor. I think because a lot of Portland voters just saw that the city was not working well and needed a new lease on life. And so I think that there are ways of bringing in fresh blood and improve things. And some of the same has come in the deep red states in the South, where no Democrat is going to have a chance of winning, but you do have reformists coming in from that party. And boy, I hope so, because without that oversight and accountability, we're all screwed. And then Measure 5, this is the tax-based question, right? So I mean that we have a profoundly screwed up tax system here that has undermined our ability to support things like local schools in effective ways. And that is I don't have a solution to that problem, but I think it's a profound problem that ties together many of the challenges the state faces. But how we fix the tax structure, I think, in that context is really hard and complicated.
Here's our last question.
Thank you. I'm interested in knowing more about how you talk with your friends and neighbors who with differing views, because I also have some relatives and friends. And how do you deal with the fact that they are getting their information from different sources? And so someone else alluded to this also. I mean, do you feel, how do you let them know that there is other information out there without being condescending? Or, I mean, you can't just say, well, you're listening to this news source that's giving you false information, because that would make them feel badly.
Yeah.
But you have to, how do you deal with that by, how are they open to listening to, looking at other news sources, or open to the fact that, or how do you tell them the truth, basically?
I love the way you put that. So, look, I mean, it's hard, and but I do think a central point is you've got to listen if you want them to listen to you. So you listen to somebody who offers this kind of rant that bears very little correlation to reality, but you have to listen, and then you can't be dismissive and say, oh, that's complete bullshit. You have to, be a little more kind of understanding and say, I'm not sure that's exactly right, because, my understanding is, and then, something else. And again, I think that to the extent possible, you can complexify the issue and bring it to these kind of murky areas, then that helps people at least open their minds to the idea that there may be an alternative point of view, another way of thinking about it. And and I think talking about individuals helps too. On immigration, I found that people are, a lot of my neighbors were really upset about what they perceived as open borders, and from their point of view, Democrats wanting to, just completely open the borders. And it wasn't always very fruitful to talk about immigration at the 30,000-foot level, but when you talk about Moises Sultani in Newburgh, who'd been in the U.S. for 29 years, hard-working guy who his kids were U.S. citizens, who has worked in a vineyard management company for years, and then started his own vineyard management company, hired 10 Americans, and then all of a sudden at 5:30 a.m. when he's going to work, ICE arrests him and deports him and breaks up the family. That does, it may not change their minds, but it reminds them of the complexity of it. And this notion in particular of the U.S. citizen kids being hurt because of ICE's aggressiveness toward undocumented parents, I think that's an issue that makes people uncomfortable. And as long as you don't wag your fingers, but you raise these and ask them what they think, maybe you can get people to move just a little bit. And to preserve democracy in this country, we don't need to have 100% of people being, right, as you put it. We just need 51%. And there needs to be a movement, but it needs to be a movement in Ohio and in a few other states. And so much is at stake this year. And I think that if we can do our best to avoid that condescension, to understand as fully as possible the traumas and pain that a lot of folks who disagree with us are going through, and avoid this temptation to think that everybody on the other side of the divide is a racist and a bigot, that it's complicated, that people are complicated, that we're all complicated. And that willingness to listen, I think, can begin to heal some of these rifts. I think that may be helpful in a couple of years when a Democrat is elected again, and can maybe begin to heal these much broader divisions in the country and reduce the toxicity of the debate. Thank you all for having me here. Thank you.